Then you can ask, since Jesus said we must be born again in order to see God's kingdom, John 3:3, how can you expect to see the kingdom established if you are not born again? Now we're going to deal with the issue of an organization. Does God use an organization to communicate his truth? And what is the evidence for or against an organization being used in the early church? I asked Jehovah's Witnesses, if Jehovah always uses an organization to direct his people, why is there no evidence of a governing body in Jerusalem during the preaching work of the first century Christians? Well, to show that, I'll point out some verses. Acts 13:2-4. Holy Spirit directed the church at Antioch and sent out Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey, as well as their second and the third. And there was no indication that the church in Jerusalem, which is where the organization would have been held, was involved in this at all. In the Watchtower, they teach that the organization, Jehovah's governing body, existed in Jerusalem. Everything had to go through Jerusalem for all the decisions that were made in the early church. Acts 13, Acts 14, verse 26-28. They reported to Antioch, a congregation, not to Jerusalem. Acts 18:22, Antioch oversaw the second and third missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul as well. And Acts 8:5, 26, 29, and verse 40, the Holy Spirit directed to Philip without any reference to the church in Jerusalem. In fact, if you look in Acts 8, it was only after Philip had done a number of preaching in different areas and actually had seen people come to know the Lord that the church at Jerusalem even found out what he was doing. The Holy Spirit was directing the activities of the early church. And then we see in Acts 16, 6 and 7, the Spirit of Jesus directed Paul and Silas as well. Not a church in Jerusalem, not a governing body or an organization. The only two verses that the Watchtower can bring up to try to say that there was an organization, a governing body in Jerusalem serving is in Acts 15 and Acts 16, verse 4. In Acts 15 is where the discussion of circumcision came up, and they were trying to decide, should all these new believers that were Gentiles that did not have the circumcision act done, should they be circumcised in order to be Christians? And ultimately, they ended up going up to Jerusalem to settle that dispute. Why? Because certain men from that area had come down and started the dispute in the first place. These men from Judea, from Jerusalem, came down and said, hey, you guys need to be circumcised. So they went up to Jerusalem to hash it out. That does not show Jerusalem as being a hub for all the leadership activities. In fact, I'll ask a Jehovah's Witness when we discuss the context of that passage. I'll say, how can Acts 15 be evidence of a governing body in Jerusalem when the dispute over circumcision was caused by men from that area? Is it any wonder apostles from Antioch went to Jerusalem to settle the dispute? How can their proclamation of the results of the decision at Acts 16, verse 4, be evidence of Jerusalem's leadership in all the congregations of the early church? Obviously not, because it was just that one case where they had to go to Jerusalem to settle the dispute caused by men from that area. So we see a governing body, contrary to Watchtower Society claims, did not exist in the early church. What about this faithful and discreet slave passage in Matthew 24, 44-45? We'll just read this and see if you get an idea of an organization in this passage. Is there any indication of this being an organization? Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave who his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave shall begin to beat his fellow slaves, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and shall cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. Weeping shall there be, and gnashing of teeth. Okay, you have faithful slaves, and you have an unfaithful slave. Jesus is giving a parable to talk about the opportunity that every Christian has. You can either be faithful in doing what the Lord has given you, and receive the reward of being able to be put in charge of the possessions that God has for you, or you can be an evil slave who goes out there and beats the masters and does not treat people right. Well, and there are some churches that have done that. And so we would say in those cases, God will have some words for them. when he returns, when Jesus returns. So that's the context. Nowhere does it say this is an organization that's going to be set up in the last days, or that this faithful slave is a group of people. It's talking about individuals, and it's an illustration of that. Incidentally, Jesus used many examples of faithful slaves and unfaithful slaves in various other parables that the Watchtower doesn't even look at when they try to set up their authority structure. What about preaching the kingdom door to door? Jehovah's Witnesses will ask you that. Do you preach the kingdom door to door? We go door to door. I haven't seen you knock on the doors of my neighborhood. Well, let's look at Acts chapter 2, verse 46. It says, and day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness. Well, that doesn't sound like, okay, the breaking bread from house to house. You know, the Jehovah's Witness comes to your door and where's his bread? It says they break bread from house to house. Where's your bread? Well, the context was house churches. In the early church, they didn't have all these big meeting places to be able to meet in. So they would rotate. They would go to the synagogues during the morning service, like on a Sunday, and they would then hear the message at the synagogue. Then they'd come home and have a fellowship meal, breaking bread from this house to another house of the believers. They did not knock on the doors of everyone in their city to, hey, can you want some bread? Can we come over? No, they didn't do that. They wouldn't have been invited, especially in the Apostle Paul's home when he was Saul. You can imagine that. They would not have been invited until he came to know the Lord. So that is the context of all of these verses. This is one of the verses of I think 3 that they bring up to try to say we got to go door to door. But in reality, it's talking about a fellowship meal. In Acts 17, Paul preached in the Jewish synagogue in Thessalonica, publicly in the marketplace of Athens as well. Was Paul not engaged in preaching the kingdom because he did not preach door to door in these cities? Well, no. Well, then, but you accuse me of not preaching the kingdom door to door because I don't knock on the doors of all these people in my neighborhood. And in reality, Paul didn't do so either in a lot of these cities, because the method was go to the marketplaces, go to the synagogues where people would congregate and preach there. And then when they come to Christ, they would open their homes for the fellowship meals that they would break from house to house.